On the morning of the 11th of January 1990, staff at Greenwich Hospital on Sydney's lower North Shore were caring for 4 terminally ill women in the hospital's palliative care ward. Among them was 82-year-old Daisy Roberts. That morning, a pie salesman wearing a blue and white 4 and 20 pies company jacket entered the ward carrying a clipboard. He was a familiar face. As part of his delivery rounds, he regularly visited hospitals and businesses across Sydney. He approached Mrs. Roberts and began speaking with her. According to Mrs. Roberts, the man asked if she was losing any body heat. He then lifted her nightgown and indecently assaulted her. Mrs. Roberts reached for the bedside call buzzer. Her call was answered by Sister Pauline Davis. When Sister Davis entered the room, she found the man standing beside Mrs. Roberts' bed. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. The man immediately fled the ward. Sister Davis chased him through the hospital and into the car park. Before he drove away, she memorised and recorded the registration number of his vehicle. Because the man regularly delivered pies to the hospital, members of staff were able to provide police with his name. A week later, detectives returned to Greenwich Hospital with a photograph. Both Daisy Roberts and Sister Pauline Davis independently identified the same man. His name was John Wayne Glover. Police arranged to interview Glover on the 13th of January 1990, but he failed to attend. Shortly afterwards, detectives were informed that Glover had attempted suicide and had been admitted to Royal North Shore Hospital. While there, hospital staff handed investigators a suicide note written on 4 and 20 pies letterhead. The note contained 2 brief but unsettling statements. "No more grannies," and Essie started it. The information gathered during the Greenwich Hospital investigation was significant. However, it was not immediately forwarded to the detectives leading the North Shore homicide investigation. To understand why John Wayne Glover came to the attention of the investigators, we need to go back almost a year. It was Wednesday, the 1st of March, 1989. Gwendoline Mitchelhill was 82 years old and lived alone in an apartment building on Military Road in Mossman. Despite her age, she remained independent and regularly walked to nearby shops and clubs. On the afternoon of the 1st of March, Mrs. Mitchelhill visited the Mossman RSL club before beginning the short walk home. Also at the club that afternoon was John Wayne Glover. Investigators would later establish that Glover watched Mrs. Mitchelhill leave the club before returning to his vehicle, where he retrieved a hammer and concealed it beneath his clothing. He then followed the 82-year-old woman to her apartment building on Military Road. As Mrs. Mitchelhill entered the foyer, Glover followed her inside and launched a brutal attack. Using the hammer, he repeatedly struck her on the head. Even after she collapsed to the floor, the assault continued. Glover repeatedly struck her body, leaving Mrs. Mitchelhill with several broken ribs in addition to the catastrophic head injuries. He stole her handbag, which contained approximately $100, before fleeing the scene. A short time later, 2 schoolboys discovered Mrs. Mitchelhill lying unconscious in the foyer and raised the alarm. Believing she had suffered a serious fall, neighbours came to her aid while an ambulance was called. Before police arrived, the foyer was washed down in the genuine belief that it was the scene of an accident. In doing so, valuable forensic evidence was unknowingly destroyed. Mrs. Mitchelhill was taken to hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. Despite their efforts, she died from her injuries. The extent of Mrs. Mitchelhill's injuries immediately stood out to investigators. The repeated blows, the broken ribs, and the level of violence appeared grossly disproportionate to the theft of a handbag containing approximately $100. Although robbery was considered a possible motive, detectives were left questioning why such extreme force had been used. With no eyewitnesses and much of the forensic evidence unknowingly destroyed before police arrived, the investigation quickly reached a dead end. Mrs. Mitchelhill's murder would later be recognised as the first known killing in a series of attacks that would terrorise Sydney's lower North Shore. Lady Winfreda Isabel Ashton was 84 years old and the widow of renowned Australian artist Sir Will Ashton. She lived alone in a unit on Raglan Street, Mossman, and despite her age remained active and independent. On the morning of the 9th of May, Lady Ashton left her apartment to take a bag of rubbish to the communal bin area. Glover was waiting. As she entered the rubbish alcove, he attacked her with a hammer, striking her repeatedly to the head. Investigators would later learn that Lady Ashton fought back fiercely. According to Glover, the 84-year-old woman almost overpowered him before he forced her to the ground. He then continued the assault until she was unconscious. After the attack, Glover removed Lady Ashton's own pantyhose and tied them tightly around her neck. He stole her handbag before carefully placing her shoes neatly side by side. Her walking stick was laid beside them. When residents discovered Lady Ashton, she was lying face down across the concrete floor of the rubbish alcove. A pool of blood had formed around her head. She was still alive. Paramedics rushed her to hospital, but despite every effort to save her, Lady Ashton died from her injuries. The crime scene immediately presented investigators with a number of disturbing questions. Although Lady Ashton's handbag had been stolen, valuable jewellery, including expensive rings, had been left untouched. The offender had also remained at the scene long enough to remove the victim's own pantyhose and use them as a ligature to strangle her before carefully arranging her shoes and walking stick beside her body. The similarities to the murder of Gwendoline Mitchelhill were difficult to dismiss. The level of violence, together with the deliberate arrangement of items left at the scene, suggested investigators might be looking for something more than a violent robber. Detectives began seriously considering whether the same offender could be responsible for both murders. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 2nd of November 1989, 78-year-old Dorothy Benke was walking home from the local shops in Lane Cove carrying several heavy grocery bags. As she struggled with the weight, a well-dressed man wearing a suit and tie approached her. "Can I carry your bags, madam?" he asked. Mrs. Benke politely declined, but paused for a moment before changing her mind. She later recalled looking him over and deciding he appeared harmless enough. Dressed like a true gentleman, there was nothing about him that caused her any concern. The man carried her groceries through a private laneway to her unit in Ridgeway, chatting comfortably as they walked. When Mrs. Benke thanked him, he replied, "It's nice to know there are still some ladies around." He even asked whether she used the swimming pool in her front yard. Nothing about the encounter seemed unusual. At her front door, Mrs. Benke thanked the stranger and offered him a cup of tea. He smiled, declined the invitation, and walked away. She had no way of knowing she had just spent several minutes talking to the granny killer. Just 15 minutes later, in the same area, Glover encountered 85-year-old Margaret Pahud. He followed Mrs. Pahud into a quiet laneway before attacking her with a hammer. Mrs. Pahud suffered repeated blows to the head. After stealing her handbag, Glover rearranged her clothing, exposing her left shoulder and breast before carefully placing her shoes at her feet. He then left the scene. Margaret Pahud was discovered by a young schoolgirl who initially mistook her for a pile of discarded clothing. As she moved closer, she realised a woman was lying on the ground and ran to get help. Mrs. Pahud was taken to hospital with catastrophic head injuries, but died soon afterwards. After leaving the scene, Glover drove to the Lane Cove Country Club. He searched through Mrs. Pahud's handbag before throwing it into a stormwater drain near the 9th tee. He later used the stolen $400 to gamble at the Mosman RSL. Dorothy Benke's chance encounter would later prove to be one of the most important witness accounts in the investigation. Having spent several minutes walking and talking with Glover, she was able to provide detectives with a detailed description of the man she had trusted enough to let carry her groceries home. Less than 24 hours after the murder of Margaret Pahud, John Wayne Glover struck again. It was Friday, the 3rd of November, 1989. Olive Cleveland was 81 years old and lived at the Wesley Gardens retirement village in Belrose. That day, Glover arrived at the retirement village in his role as a 4 pie salesman. Outside the main building, he noticed Mrs. Cleveland sitting alone on a bench and struck up a friendly conversation. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but something about the encounter made Mrs. Cleveland uneasy. She ended the conversation and began walking back towards the main building. Glover followed. Seizing her from behind, he forced the 81-year-old woman down a ramp into a secluded laneway. There, he repeatedly slammed her head against the concrete until she was unconscious. He then removed Mrs. Cleveland's own pantyhose and used them to strangle her. Before leaving, Glover stole $60 from her purse. He carefully rearranged her clothing before placing her shoes and walking stick neatly at her feet. Mrs. Cleveland was later found by staff and residents of the retirement village. Believing she had suffered a terrible fall, well-intentioned people washed down the area before police arrived, unknowingly destroying valuable forensic evidence for the second time during the investigation. Olive Cleveland died from her injuries. The murder demonstrated that Glover was prepared to travel beyond his familiar hunting grounds in Mossman in search of victims. It also revealed how effectively he concealed his crimes behind the appearance of an ordinary working life. By day, he was a polite 4-and-20 pie salesman making routine deliveries to retirement villages and hospitals across Sydney. Behind that respectable facade, he was selecting his next victim. As public fear continued to grow, the New South Wales government doubled the reward for information leading to the killer's arrest to $200,000. Just 3 weeks after the murder of Olive Cleveland, John Wayne Glover claimed his fifth known victim. It was Thursday, the 23rd of November, 1989. Muriel Falconer was 92 years old and lived alone in a Federation home on Muston Street, Mossman. Although partially deaf and blind, she remained fiercely independent and was well known in the local community. At around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Mrs. Falconer was walking home from the Buena Vista Hotel carrying her shopping. John Wayne Glover saw her. He returned to his car, parked opposite the Mossman police station, and retrieved a hammer and a pair of cream and green striped gardening gloves. He then followed the 92-year-old woman home. As Mrs. Falconer unlocked the front door of her house, Glover forced his way inside. Clamping one hand over her mouth, he repeatedly struck her on the head and neck with the hammer. For a brief moment, Mrs. Falconer regained consciousness and cried out for help. Glover responded by striking her repeatedly until she fell silent. He then removed her pantyhose and strangled her. Before leaving, Glover stole $100 from her purse and carefully arranged Mrs. Falconer's shoes beside her body. Muriel Falconer was not discovered until the following afternoon, when a concerned neighbour, worried that she had not answered her door, used a spare key to enter the house. Unlike the previous murders, the crime scene inside Mrs. Falconer's home remained undisturbed before detectives arrived. For the first time, investigators were able to conduct a thorough forensic examination without crucial evidence being unintentionally destroyed. They recovered bloody shoe prints left by the killer, providing the investigation with its first major forensic breakthrough. A neighbour also reported seeing a middle-aged, portly, grey-haired man in the area around the time of the murder, adding another important piece to the growing picture detectives were building of the offender. The murder marked another disturbing escalation. John Wayne Glover was no longer waiting for isolated pathways or secluded laneways. He was now prepared to follow an elderly woman to her front door, force his way inside, and kill her in the place where she should have been safest. By March 1990, detectives had narrowed their investigation to one man, John Wayne Glover. It was Monday, the 19th of March 1990. Joan Sinclair was 60 years old and lived alone at Beauty Point. She was the youngest of Glover's 6 known murder victims. Unlike the others, Joan knew her killer. The two had become close over several years. They played bridge together and had developed a long-term relationship. That morning, detectives placed Glover under surveillance. They watched as he left home, stopped at a bottle shop to buy a bottle of VAT 69 Scotch, and then drove to Joan Sinclair's house. The surveillance team watched as Joan warmly greeted him at the front door before inviting him inside. Believing they were witnessing a routine visit between Glover and his girlfriend, detectives saw no reason to intervene. Inside the house, Glover picked up a claw hammer and struck Joan Sinclair on the back of the head. He then removed her pantyhose and strangled her. At around 3:30 that afternoon, Joan Sinclair's 2 grandsons arrived for a visit. They knocked on the door but received no answer. As daylight faded and the house remained silent, detectives realised something was terribly wrong. At approximately 6 o'clock that evening, officers looked through a glass door and spotted a blood-stained hammer lying inside. Police forced entry into the house. They discovered Joan Sinclair dead. Searching the home, officers made their way to the bathroom. There, they found John Wayne Glover unconscious in a bathtub filled with water. He had swallowed Valium, drunk the bottle of scotch, and slashed his left wrist in an apparent attempt to take his own life. The man who had terrorised Sydney's North Shore for more than a year was finally in police custody. But for many of the detectives involved, the arrest was overshadowed by a haunting question. If information from the Greenwich Hospital incident had reached the North Shore Murder Task Force 25 days earlier, could Joan Sinclair's life have been saved? By the time John Wayne Glover was arrested, detectives realised that murders were only part of a much longer story. Months before his first known murder, Glover had already begun targeting elderly women across Sydney's North Shore. At first, the attacks appeared to be little more than violent robberies. On January 11th, 1989, Margaret Todhunter was walking through Mosman when Glover suddenly assaulted her. Rather than using a weapon, he punched the elderly woman in the head before stealing her handbag containing $209. Mrs. Todhunter survived the attack, but because she was visiting from Queensland, she did not report the robbery to police until December that year. By then, detectives recognised striking similarities with the attacks they were investigating. Several months later, Glover targeted Euphemia Effie Carney outside the North Haven retirement village in Linfield. Again, he relied on sudden violence rather than a weapon. A single powerful blow to the upper chest knocked Mrs. Carney to the ground. Glover stole her groceries and a handbag containing $70 before fleeing. Although she survived, the attack demonstrated the same preference for elderly women who were alone and returning home during the late afternoon. On October 18th, 1989, Doris Cox became another victim. After following her into a secluded stairwell at her retirement village in Mosman, Glover rammed her face into a brick wall before stealing her handbag. Mrs. Cox survived, but her description of the attacker initially sent detectives in the wrong direction. Believing her attacker was a young man, possibly even a teenager, investigators continued searching for someone much younger than the man they were actually hunting. As detectives looked back over the attacks, a clear pattern began to emerge. Glover almost always struck between 3 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. He watched elderly women as they returned home from shopping, visited clubs, or walked alone through quiet streets. He was well-dressed, polite, and unthreatening. On at least one occasion, he even offered to carry an elderly woman's groceries to her home before selecting another victim only minutes later. His occupation as a 4 pie salesman gave him legitimate access to retirement villages, hospitals, and nursing homes across Sydney, allowing him to move unnoticed through the very communities he would later terrorise. Investigators also uncovered a disturbing history of indecent assaults against elderly women inside hospitals and nursing homes stretching back years before the murders began. The evidence suggested that John Wayne Glover's obsession with elderly women had not appeared suddenly in 1989. It had been developing for decades. Even today, many detectives believe the official death toll may not tell the full story. In the days before his death, retired Detective Inspector Dennis O'Toole, the only person known to have visited John Wayne Glover during his final years in prison, met with him one last time. Before the visit ended, Glover handed O'Toole a simple sketch. It showed a quiet park with 2 pine trees. Hidden among the branches of the tree on the right was the number 9. Glover never explained its meaning. To some investigators, the drawing was a final confession, an indication that the 6 murders for which he was convicted were not the full extent of his crimes. Others have cautioned that the sketch proves nothing, and may simply have been another attempt by Glover to manipulate those investigating him. No additional murders have ever been proven. Whether the hidden number was a genuine confession or one last attempt to create mystery is something only John Wayne Glover ever knew. Retired detectives have also identified him as a suspect in several other unsolved killings dating back to the 1960s. Whether those suspicions can ever be proven remains uncertain, but one conclusion is difficult to escape. The 6 women officially recognised as victims may not have been the only lives John Wayne Glover destroyed. Following his arrest at Joan Sinclair's home, John Wayne Glover was taken to hospital under police guard after his attempted suicide. Once he had recovered, detectives began preparing the case that would finally bring the granny killer to trial. In November 1991, Glover appeared before the Supreme Court in Darlinghurst, charged with the murders of Gwendoline Mitchelhill, Lady Winfreda Ashton, Margaret Pahud, Olive Cleveland, Muriel Falconer and Joan Sinclair, along with the attacks on Margaret Todd Hunter, Euphemia Carney and Doris Cox. His defence did not deny that the attacks had occurred. Instead, Glover pleaded not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from a mental abnormality that substantially impaired his ability to control his actions. The trial became a battle between psychiatric experts. Glover claimed there were two sides to his personality. A good Glover who lived an ordinary family life, and a bad Glover who committed the murders. Psychiatrists told the court his obsession with elderly women stemmed from a deeply troubled relationship with his mother, Frida. They suggested that after her death in early 1989, Glover redirected years of anger towards elderly women, symbolically reliving that resentment with each attack. But the prosecution argued the evidence showed something very different. After every murder, Glover took the hammer home and washed it in acid to destroy traces of blood and bone. He carefully selected vulnerable victims, attacked only when the risk of interruption was low, stole from many of them, and repeatedly demonstrated an ability to plan, adapt, and avoid detection. To prosecutors, these were not the actions of a man incapable of controlling himself. They were the actions of a calculating predator. The jury agreed. John Wayne Glover was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and the attacks on Margaret Todd Hunter, Euphemia Carney, and Doris Cox. During sentencing, Justice James Wood described Glover as a man of extreme cunning who preyed on vulnerable elderly women while carefully judging the risks of being caught. He sentenced Glover to 6 terms of life imprisonment and ordered that he never be released, declaring him a continuing danger to the community. For the families of the victims, the verdict finally brought justice. Justice James Wood sentenced John Wayne Glover to 6 terms of life imprisonment and ordered that he never be released. For the families of Gwendoline Mitchelhill, Lady Winfreda Ashton, Margaret Pahud, Olive Cleveland, Muriel Falconer and Joan Sinclair, the verdict brought justice, but it could never undo the pain left by his crimes. Glover spent the remainder of his life behind bars. Over time, he became increasingly isolated. His wife, Gay, and their 2 daughters were reportedly devastated by his arrest and conviction. Family members are said to have cut ties with him, and for the final 15 years of his life, he received no visits from relatives. On the 10th of September 2005, at the age of 72, John Wayne Glover was found hanging in his cell at Lithgow Correctional Centre. An inquest later heard that he may not have intended to end his life, but instead hoped to be discovered in time and transferred to another prison. Whatever his intentions, the attempt proved fatal. Even in death, he was alone. His family refused to claim his body. With no one willing to arrange a funeral, Glover faced the prospect of a pauper's burial. Instead, a woman described only as a long-time friend came forward to pay for a private funeral and burial, ensuring he would not be laid to rest in an unmarked grave. 6 innocent women lost their lives to a man who, to neighbours, work colleagues, and even close friends, appeared to be an ordinary, respectable member of the community. They are the people this story should be remembered for. Their lives were stolen, their families were changed forever, and their memories remain the true legacy of one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, please consider subscribing to Oculus Lupi. Your support helps us continue producing carefully researched documentaries. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this case, or have additional information from reliable sources, please leave a respectful comment below.